This is probably one of the most significant business transformations that will happen. We did this whole cloud transformation over the last, 8 years, but this is literally augmenting intelligence inside of a company. And so it's going to be highly transformational. It's going to touch every part of the company.
Welcome to Workmorphous Wired, where we dive deep into the future of work and explore the transformative impact of AI and other emerging tech through conversations with thought leaders, policy experts, and industry innovators. I'm your host, Emily Fabiano, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Rehgan Avon for our inaugural episode. Rehgan and I met through our involvement with OhioX, which is a membership organization representing the voice of tech in Ohio. Rehgan is co-founder and CEO of AlignAI, which is an organization that helps companies successfully adopt AI. She also founded Women in Analytics, is the host of the AI or Die podcast, which we love the name of, and a recent recipient of the Ohio Trailblazers Award presented by Verizon for her role in transforming Ohio tech. She's a leading voice in the industry and across the nation, and we're grateful that she could join us today. Welcome, Rehgan.
Thank you, Emily. I am honored to be in the inaugural episode.
Thank you. We're so excited to have you. So let's jump right into it. Tell us a little bit about your background, about AlignAI, and maybe something that you're working on that you're proud of.
Yeah, so I've spent the last almost decade of my career in the AI space, which might shock some people just because I think a lot of folks got introduced to AI in the last year. This is actually a field that has been making a ton of progress for a long time now. So I've spent most of my career helping enterprises navigate the complexities of artificial intelligence, which has been a huge passion of mine. I got into AI because I was really obsessed with this idea of being able to predict the future, which is what AI does. It's got predictive capabilities. And looking at data and trying to find meaningful relationships between that data to help us make better decisions. And what I quickly realized was the field of AI is actually like reverse engineering humans. So it actually requires us to get a really deep understanding of how humans work and think and consume information and make decisions. And so in my work over the last almost decade has just been trying to understand why people have a hard time adopting AI solutions. And so my co-founder, Brendan, and I launched AlignAI because we saw a really big opportunity to help organizations figure that part out so that they could basically put all of this large amount of investment that they've put towards AI to work and get some positive benefits from it. So we've been building AlignAI for the last 3 years. I'm super proud of the work that we're doing. We do a lot of education in this space for tons of different people, anywhere from a technical person to a non-technical person, which I think is super important. And we are building our platform, which helps organizations literally get aligned around AI. But I'm very proud of the work that we've done. We've been able to affect and impact tons of people's careers through the work we're doing. And I do think it's very meaningful because this is going to have a huge, huge impact on our society.
Absolutely. I love that. Congratulations on all the successes so far. It's really exciting to see how much work that you've accomplished, even in the time that we've known each other, and how much it's growing. Also excited to come back to the fact that AI isn't a new thing, although a lot of people have learned about it in the last year or so. But what I think is so powerful is the way that you're providing education opportunities at all different levels. I think that's really cool. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And I've come to I've come at this from a technical perspective. I'm an engineer by trade. So, and I came to this space as an engineer, thinking about some of the computer science challenges that we faced in making these AI models more accurate, more performant. But over the last 5 years, I've grown a really deep empathy of others approaching AI. And I understand how complicated and complex and nuanced this whole thing is. And quite frankly, how scary this can be to people. And so I think the immense amount of empathy that I've been able to form for those types of individuals that may not have the technical depth has forced me to think about ways that I could properly communicate what it is, why it could be useful, some of the risks behind it, just so we can help demystify this like quote unquote new technology.
I love that. And it's such a good transition because that's really what we were hoping to get out of this conversation today is demystifying some of these topics in AI and specifically generative AI. So as you know, we launched this podcast to empower professionals in business, government, and education with insights into AI so that they know what's coming and other technologies that impact the future of work. So some of our listeners may have a technical background, but most of them are probably in that category where, they're wondering how AI will impact them, how it's going to impact their communities, their constituents, their companies, etc. So we know that generative AI is all over the news right now, and it's not something you can miss unless you live under a rock and don't read the news, right? But it's not often well explained. And so given your expertise, would love to start with the basics. So if you would, can you just kind of explain to us what is AI in general and when was it first introduced? Because you mentioned you've been working in this space for 10 years. A lot of people learned about it about a year ago. Tell us a little bit about that history.
Yeah, so I always start on defining AI by saying, okay, what does it stand for? So it's artificial intelligence. So if we break down those words, intelligence, which is a really hard word to define. So if you ask anybody what intelligence is, they may give you an example of someone that they deem to be intelligent. And the reason I point out that level of nuance is because we are trying to define what that means, and we're trying to artificially replicate human intelligence in computers. And it turns out really, really hard thing to do. So if you think about humans, how are humans intelligent? What gives you signals of intelligence? And I think even though that's very nuanced, there's a couple of things that we can break down on how we take in information and make decisions on a daily basis. So I mentioned it's like reverse engineering people. We have to deeply understand people so that we can get computers to do things in a similar fashion. Now, the motivation around why we're doing that is a whole other conversation. But just to break it down from an engineering perspective, as individuals, we consume information, whether through sound, sight, touch, all of our senses, right? We gather information. If we're standing at a bus stop, if we're in a busy intersection, we are constantly getting noise and signal. Now, we may not be very conscious of what we're consuming, but we are consuming tons and tons of information. And then our brains are trained over time, from the time we're kids to the time we're adults, to create relationships between that data that we consume. So if you're trying to cross the street, we look left and right, we look for cars, we look at the signal. We've been trained that those are good indicators on predicting whether or not we're going to be in danger. Models on computers do the same thing. So we feed them tons of data and we create, I'm sure everyone has heard the word, an algorithm, which basically its job is to create a statistical relationship between that data that gives you signal on something that helps you predict the future. So for these language models that ChatGPT uses, the goal is to get a computer to interpret text, understand human language, and be able to produce human language. And that turns out to be very complicated. We have a lot of natural ability to do that with our brains, and that's still not very understood, right? Like there's a lot of people that study how the brain works and they still don't know deeply how that works yet. But we try to do through very inefficient manners. We try to do this with computers. So we feed the computer tons and tons of historical examples of human language, which just so happen to be from Reddit, Wikipedia, the internet. And we give it an algorithm that creates relationships between words. So this word is similar to that word, or used in sentences similar to this word. And then that algorithm predicts the next best word. So a lot of times we like to think that this thing is sentient or is, got human characteristics, but really it's math and stats and compute. Just like we are consuming tons of information, we have brains that put that information together, and then we action off of what we think we need to do next. So That's the most basic way that I can break down AI. Now, the level of complexity on what kind of data we feed it, how we set up the system around it to be able to make decisions, the compute that we throw at this thing so that it can process more of these relationships between data. All of those things turn out to be really, really hard to do. But we are getting way better at it, which is why we're at the point we're at now, which is we've come to this moment where it's useful enough that it's almost scary to some people on how good it is.
Absolutely, and it's so accessible to so many people, and that's what feels like it's so novel to me is just the accessibility of it. It's very easy to interact with in a way that most people can interface with comfortably because it feels like text messaging or something. You mentioned, the foundations of generative AI, but I think it's worth distinguishing what is the difference between artificial intelligence and generative AI specifically.
Yeah, great question. So I usually start off in my any presentation I'm doing about it with a basic definition of where ChatGPT and generative AI fall into this bigger bucket of AI. So I talked broadly about AI, and then I gave you an example around text. And that I gave you the example of ChatGPT, which now also takes images. So it's what we call multimodal. So it's taking text and images now, which is really cool. So the bubbles that I usually show is this big bubble that includes AI. And then within AI, we have this smaller bubble called machine learning, which is that process, like I mentioned, of getting a computer to learn relationships between things. And then under that is something called deep learning, which is essentially just the technique that we are leveraging to create those relationships. So you'll often hear neural networks associated in that kind of deep learning bubble, which is really just the algorithmic structure that we're leveraging. And there's lots of options you can use in terms of, these techniques or these algorithms, but this neural network falls under this bucket of deep learning. And then there's generative AI, which is the ability to generate new information. So in machine learning, we can do things like, hey, give me the most likely item to buy with a loaf of bread at a grocery store. That might be an example of a machine learning problem where we have tons of items and tons of transactions of tons of people who have bought items at a grocery store. And based off of that data, we use an algorithm to say, people buy eggs with bread most often. And so, we might do much, like a ton of different things with that information. But based on data and statistics, we can tell you that people most often buy those two items together. Generative is literally creating new information. So instead of classifying or identifying, items, we are actually creating images, creating text, creating video. So something net new, we're kind of predicting what image you might want based off of a prompt, or we might be summarizing information, or we might be writing a story based off of a prompt. This is the generative piece of generative AI.
That's awesome. That's a really helpful distinction and one that I think gets lost often in a lot of the conversations that are going on today. One of the things that's really exciting is the potential of generative AI for productivity. And this plays into the economy and it plays into the future of work. And I'd like to explore each of those topics with you. One interesting stat that came out recently, Goldman Sachs predicts that generative AI could raise the global GDP by 7% over 10 years. And that's to the tune of $7 trillion, which is obviously very significant. Of course, that potential depends on the ability for organizations and people to successfully adopt this technology and to use the capabilities in the best way. So you work with enterprises that are seeking to adopt AI. What are some of the common hesitations that you hear from companies? Tell us a little bit about that and then maybe risk management.
So you mentioned risk. Risk is usually the number one reason that organizations are slowing down a little bit and trying to get their arms around this whole thing. Often people fear what they don't know, which is why there's a lot of kind of fear mongering happening around this space. Because as I just explained, there's really not a great way to understand deeply how these things work. I can even tell you that there are lots of researchers who are still trying to figure out why this neural network structure or this transformer structure works the way that it does. We've tried to replicate how the brain works, but it's not quite as efficient and elegant as the human brain. So I think companies are struggling to understand what it is. So you have, your risk and legal teams and your security teams whose jobs are to make sure that they reduce risk for the company. And a lot of them don't quite grasp what this is and how a company might use it or why the benefits might overweigh on the risks here. So education is usually number one because right now there's a friction between those that are trying to reduce risk and those who are trying to innovate. So you have innovation teams pushing really hard on identifying interesting use cases that will be meaningful for the company, things that might be differentiated in the market. And then you have all of these other factors, rightfully so, governing that innovation and trying to make sure that we're moving slowly and smartly through this ecosystem. I will not say that some of that fear mongering is unwarranted. There's actually a lot of damage that can be done by AI. We've already seen this happen quite often, actually. There's been congressional hearings around AI's role in social media, and there's been lots of issues that have been uncovered about facial recognition technology, which is AI. It's the computer's ability to interpret faces from images, video. So, there's a lot of good reasons why we should be careful and guardrails that need to be put in place. I think for a long time, we've only really seen more simplistic implementations of AI at the enterprise level. And so it's been easier to put guardrails in place because we know how it works, we know the potential outcomes, and we can kind of manage to that. This newer technique is really hard to understand. So we don't necessarily know why it's making certain outcomes the way that it is. We don't necessarily understand how it works deeply. And that becomes a huge challenge because if we don't understand how it works, how are we supposed to kind of manage expectations on things that it produces? So I think there's some hesitancy from that perspective. There are a lot of really good frameworks being pushed out there for organizations to follow, checklists, approaches on risk management, on monitoring these things. There's a lot of new security concerns on these models as well. And so we kind of have to apply and extend a lot of what we know to something that's automated and can scale much faster than people. And so when you've got the human in the loop, we can kind of control that a little bit more. Are there inside, issues like threats to companies? 100%. But let's not magnify that maybe with an AI model that could do some of those nefarious actions as well. And so I think that's the major concern is if we don't understand how it works and we are accelerating some of our existing risks and concerns, how do we make sure we rein this thing in while still moving fast and innovating with this technology?
And is that what you are helping companies do, is kind of customize the approach based on their use case?
100%. Yeah. So we are helping companies think about frameworks and processes that they can follow so as to at least standardize on that and make improvements over time. What we've seen historically in the market is that these companies will kind of attack this from a bespoke perspective. So they have these edge cases or one-off use cases, and they'll basically brute force their way through on getting this use case tested and deployed and leveraged and rolled out because they feel pressure from a time perspective. When they do that 10 more times, they now have 10 different ways that they've done it. It's hard to manage. It's hard to assess risk of all of those 10 different approaches. And so we are kind of helping people standardize on that so they can govern over those processes. And that's no different than what policymakers are trying to do as well. I always say that like policy, they're trying to either put policy over outcomes or put policy over process. So outcomes, I think, are usually fairly straightforward. Here's what we want to have happen, and here's what we don't want to have happen. Process is a little different because it's more preventative. So, can we actually put some stopgaps or milestones in place so we can prevent bad things from happening? And I don't want to over standardize or over policy things here, but I do think that consistency is going to be our friend, and we can leverage that to make some of the fundamental improvements along the way.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned, the people who are innovating, they're charged with innovating, and the people within an organization, whether it's a company or a government organization, that are responsible for mitigating risk. So, how can some of these AI innovators who are charged with the next big thing for the company or for the government, how can they balance their desire to move quickly with the need to ensure strategic alignment, feasibility, ROI, some of the things that are so important from the organizational perspective?
Yeah, I think it's hard because I have a systems background, so does my co-founder. Yeah, we both have worked at like highly unstructured, chaotic companies, aka startups. And so we live in this like this interesting nuanced ecosystem of wanting to standardize things to move fast and wanting to stay nimble. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a lot of the market wanting to move fast. We can't over policy, over process because we will halt innovation. And then there's the other argument of that where we can't let things get out of control. It's kind of hard to put things back in once you let them out. So, how do we do this? This is the key question here. I think number one is being very thorough about what the risks actually are and in what scenarios. So I think we're trying too hard to blanket these risks across everything. One of the concerns that I have around policy and these standards that are being published are that they are standards in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is AI is hyper contextual to the use case. So the harm actually happens when it's deployed doing a thing. So, in a scenario, so when it's deployed in an autonomous vehicle, when it's deployed in an autonomous vehicle in this city on this road with this history of accidents, right? It's so contextualized. So, to rein it in prior to understanding how it's being used, which is what is being somewhat proposed today, I think is a little bit of a challenge. So number one is we must contextualize some of these risks. The second is being comprehensive. And I think we're trying to be, as an industry, we are trying to be as comprehensive as possible on where these things can go wrong. And I often have my enterprise customers go through exercises on this. So if we have a use case for interpreting text from doctor notes in a hospital setting, what are all of the possible ways that that could go wrong? Well, we could come up with some probably pretty immediate ones, but it turns out it's really, really hard to come up with a comprehensive list of where those things can go wrong. And we have to think that way. That's one of the risk mitigation strategies, is to understand where these things can go wrong. So we talk about it in terms of impact. I always lay out the different dimensions of risk. So ethical risk, financial risk, reputational risk. These are different areas or lenses that we could view risk in. So I think one is just like being comprehensive about what could happen and making sure everybody's on the same page there. And the second is backing that up in reality, which is like, is that real from a technical perspective? I think we get ahead of our skis a little bit. There's a lot happening in terms of innovation for sure. And it's a couple of companies that are doing really extraordinary things. And the rest of us are not that far, not even close to that far. So, we just need to be realistic about that as well. Like, what can these things do? What's the possibility here? And what are we trying to prevent from a comprehensive perspective?
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, it seems very complex, very nuanced, evolving every day, but also it's reassuring to hear that there are conversations, there are things that leaders can be thinking about, innovators and people responsible for risk can be thinking about and acting upon and working with technical experts to help kind of map out the scenario planning, as you mentioned. That's great. One of the ethical risks that I think is on a lot of people's minds right now is the impact on workers. And I'd like to explore that a little bit. McKinsey released a report this year predicting that up to 30% of hours currently worked in the US economy, will be automated by 2030 thanks to trends accelerated by generative AI. Now, I thought that was an interesting statistic because a lot of the times when you look at future of work studies, they talk about jobs being automated, but this is actually talking about hours being automated. So, kind of tracks with this idea that generative AI will automate tasks rather than occupations, or at least that's how I interpreted it. But I'd be interested to hear your perspective on how you see generative AI specifically impacting the future of work.
Yeah, I'd say today there's a lot of waste in a day for anyone, a lot of repetition and a lot of waste. And I think sometimes we forget that because we've almost accepted it as just part of the job. Like, even if you're the most productive person ever, there's still so much waste that happens. And in fact, I've met some really clever engineers who have automated really cool things about their life. And let me tell you, they're not doing less with that time. So I think it's going to be a while before we start heading into AI replacing some of the more meaningful tasks. And when I say a while, I'm not saying 50 years from now. I think it's going to be sooner than that. I think we should probably look at a time horizon around like about 10 years, 8 to 10 years, because we're going to get rid of a lot of the waste first. And when I hear waste, I think like very repetitive tasks. I also am very sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of individuals in the workforce today where most of their tasks are considered repetitive. And we're going to have a really big opportunity to redefine what those roles look like. And that sounds probably fairly daunting for a lot of companies, but I do think it's going to be important for them to start thinking about more value add work that people can contribute towards, because this thing is not going to slow down. We are going to keep seeing more and more advancements on automation, but we need to get better at augmenting people and not automating them outright. And I think it's going to be a slow progression. It's not going to be overnight, all of these people are going to be automated. That's not how this is going to work. We're going to have time because these systems also need to learn. One thing I point out quite often is that most of these companies have horrible data. Horrible, terrible quality, incomplete. They don't have good data. I can confirm that. I've seen it firsthand. And these systems need good data to do things correctly. So we see this massive economy actually happening around data labeling, data production, buying data sources, right? This has been a thing that we've been used to for a number of years now. And the reason is these systems require all of that. So I say that because who do you think is going to be producing a lot of this data? Well, we're going to be targeting the jobs that we want, jobs, not careers, but jobs as in tasks, like the specific jobs that we want to start to get better at. And these systems tend to do really well on low variable tasks. So tasks where things are not highly variant in the scenario in which you'll find them. So it's very, very consistent day to day. And maybe there are a couple of edge cases or outliers, but for the most part, it's consistent. So I would really urge companies to think holistically around where their employees are spending time and targeting some of those highly repeatable, low risk tasks first. And that'll actually build some muscle memory for companies on how to rethink these different functions they have inside of their organization. But I think this is going to be a huge challenge. There's going to be lots of companies that do this well, and there's going to be probably even more companies that don't.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that'll be a big differentiator too in terms of productivity and all of that. It's encouraging to hear your outlook on this as a subject matter expert, especially because there is a lot of doom and gloom out there. But the data quality piece is something that I think is a really important point and one that highlights, the timeline that you shared. Also, as you talked about the amount of waste in a day, that really resonates with me. And I think as two founders, you're taking on a lot of jobs. And I think about it all the time. This seems like something I could automate. And then I work toward automating it. And sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. But I'm curious for your clients that you work with, what are some of the tasks that you recommend be automated first? Some of those more repetitive tasks that are easy, low hanging fruit?
What I typically suggest is that they look for very, very specific tasks. So, for example, they might be interested because generative AI is text based. A lot of people are thinking about what are some text based examples where we can leverage this thing. So, they immediately go to either, well, let's make a chat GPT for all of our policies, like our company policies, or let's make a chat GPT for our customers on all of our how-to docs, or they want to take all of their documentation and contextualize it for end users. This is a great thing to do. I think this is actually a really good use case. But what I usually suggest is that we scope down these use cases quite a bit. So when we're talking about customer service, can we target certain customers? Can we target certain topics? Maybe billing, let's start with billing. That's it. We're just going to field billing related questions. We're going to have these models just answer billing related questions, and only for these types of customers. So not all of our customers, but just this group. And then we can start to see how it works, make sure that not only is this a good thing from getting it out quickly and testing quickly, and probably less computational power and less cost, definitely easier to secure because you have clear expectations on what this thing is supposed to do. But then you can start to break down tasks inside of your organization similarly to that. And it'll change the way you think about jobs getting done inside of the company. So I often say, okay, what are some of the most repetitive things at the organization that are not complex and not high risk? Maybe a customer facing, generative AI app is still too high risk, and maybe we want to do something internally first. So build it, expose your customer service reps to it first, have your customer service reps train it over time because they have the domain knowledge. Have them say, no, that doesn't seem right, something more like this. Have them kind of shape that tool before you expose it to the public. So breaking things down in these bite-sized chunks, I think, will help companies move faster, less risk. But that's just one example. The other one is productivity. So a lot of these tools are now embedding functionality of generative AI into them, like Zoom. I think there's a feature on there now where it'll transcribe and summarize the transcription of everything going on in the meeting. If you join late, you can quickly catch up on what you missed. Little things like that are great. And why would if I'm company, bank X, why would I ever build that myself when I know the tools that I'm going to be leveraging will incorporate that functionality? So thinking about what's true and unique to the company that we want to do, what's going to be high value, what's going to be low risk, and how can we scope this down? I think that's a really great place to start.
Absolutely. And it's such a good use case with customer service, being able to evaluate how AI is performing and provide guidance, provide some guardrails to help improve it. But that, like you said, that's kind of a component or a task of a job versus an entire career. I am a huge nerd, admittedly, and I spent a lot of time this summer reading through the Future of Work report by the World Economic Forum. One of the things that really stuck with me is that 75% of the more than 800 companies that they surveyed expect to adopt AI, but further, they anticipate high churn. So 50% of organizations expect it to create job growth, and 25% of those organizations expect it to create job losses. So we know that there's going to be a lot of change. You talked about customer service, experts training technology or helping to improve technology. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on education or upskilling and the role that that may play as more of these technologies are tested and implemented.
I think from a technology perspective, we have always struggled with this core concept of trust. And it's only going to get worse, in my opinion, unless we find some really solid ways of bringing people along. I actually think it's a great trend that this is going to start getting highlighted more and more around trust, because there's typically not a lot of trust. When you go and work for a company, it's not like you trust that company implicitly, right? So I think there's a lot of work that these companies need to do when it comes to trust. So I think education's a great first step in that direction, which is we care about you trusting what we're doing. And therefore, we're going to provide you with educational materials on what this is and why we're doing it so you can participate. And I think that I've actually personally seen how this works. Like, when you involve people in that educational process, things change rapidly. One of our customers flew out one of their operations folks to Germany to meet with the data scientists that were working on this model they were building for them. And she came back so excited about data science and AI. And, she's part of it now. She's part of the solution, she's part of the process. Her input matters. And it is exciting to learn about this topic. It's a complicated topic. And I think we have to be very conscious of who we involve in these conversations and what we do with their participation.
Absolutely. The concept of transparency and trust throughout the process seems so essential, so foundational to me, because upskilling is an important piece of the puzzle, an essential piece of the puzzle, I would argue, because, we know that there's some sort of time horizon where more and more tasks within certain careers or jobs will be automatable. We know we need to be investing in upskilling, but that educational piece is really, it sounds like it's foundational to even be able to move to upskilling so that people know why and they know the opportunities on the other side that are available to them because of that upskilling.
100%. And I will tell you that there are not a lot of great educational resources today for non-technical folks. We've spent, I think Cassie Kozyrkov, who was at Google for a while and is now doing her own thing, which is awesome. She has this really nice saying, which is like, the only people who cared about AI before 2012 were researchers. And then between 2012 and 2022, developers cared about AI. And then after 2022, everyone cared about AI. And so we have these like moments in time where it's not a research paper in academia anymore. We can now build with it. We have tools, we have software that we can build these systems. And then now we have people who can build systems on top of that without having to know how to code. So you have all of these people who are now creating all of these hacks with ChatGPT on productivity, which is awesome. And they don't have to know how to code. So we're at this paradigm shift where we really are democratizing AI to an extent. And I think what's important to note is, because this just happened, all of the educational resources are for developers. They're for technical people. So we're upskilling technical software developers. We're upskilling database administrators. We're upskilling data engineers and data scientists and analysts. And that's great. We need to upskill those people. We need people to build systems. But we don't have a lot of good educational materials out there for non-technical individuals. I can't go and talk to a business leader and explain to them how a neural network works. There's like, they won't care. They don't care. They don't want to know. I've watched technical people mess this up for years, where they just get so excited about how it works that that's the first thing they go to. So I actually think we're in this interesting time where we need to play a little bit of catch up on some of the resources and educational resources that we can provide to folks that are not technical, and that will help us in this process.
I love that. And one of the things that you've mentioned to me previously is you host these educational opportunities, sometimes in Columbus or maybe beyond, and you've started to incorporate content specifically for technical people and non-technical people. And I think that's so valuable because, like you said, there is such a divide there. What are some of the non-technical upskilling opportunities that people could be thinking about today? For example, I'm a non-technical person, but I'm very interested, of course, in how this impacts policy, education, business. And so I personally took a Coursera course on prompt engineering just because I was curious and I wanted to learn about it. What are these types of more approachable upskilling opportunities or other things that people can be thinking about or that companies or governments could consider funding or prioritizing?
So, prompt engineering is a great thing to learn, but I think it's kind of a band aid on where we're at right now. So, it's my opinion that a chat interface is probably not the best user experience for interacting and engaging with these models. It is the first thing that we have, which is great. So, we're often confronted with this idea of prompt engineering, which is essentially just this idea that we want to give the most optimal context to the model to get the most optimal output. So, what does that mean? Well, that means that when people are thinking about AI, they need to think about the context that they have to provide to these systems to get the best output. And that means that they need to have a deep domain expertise on whatever it is that they're doing so that they can get information back that will help them take action. So these are really like critical thinking skills, right? Like, how do I map out consciously the decisions that I make throughout the day? So think about hiring an intern. Why is it so time intensive and energy intensive to have, a new intern around, right? It's because we actually have to think about what we're doing so we can teach them how to do it. And that can be kind of exhausting for us because we're like, okay, I know how to do it, but I actually have to break that down and provide that kind of educational information as to why I'm doing it this way, why I'm doing it in this order, what I'm doing, and provide that to that person so that they can learn, they can be self sufficient, and they can kind of make decisions on their own without asking these questions. This is that idea of like, micromanaging versus teaching them something that will be useful and sustainable. And that is a hard skill, but is kind of necessary for these AI systems right now. So that's the first thing that I usually teach folks when they are on the business side. Like, here's how this works. Here's what's important to know. Here's how to frame up your problem. And then we go into risks so that they can think through, okay, here's the things I should do and shouldn't do. Here's where we're at from a technology perspective. So don't expect it to know that it shouldn't do that, right? So those are kind of the high level elements there. I think I mentioned Cassie Kozyrkov earlier. She is kind of going deep into this decision science realm or decision intelligence realm, which is providing a lot of really good educational resources for non-technical individuals. I think another good person that you could follow is Ali Miller, who does a really great job of showing examples and use cases and talking about some of the technological advances and the implications of that on what we can now do with it. And she tends to post a lot of really great examples. So those are two individuals that I think non-technical individuals can follow and, at least learn alongside those folks.
That's fantastic. I love that, and I'd love to follow them. I think what we'll do is we'll track down their information and put it in the show notes, and anything else that you think would be helpful to our listeners who are looking for more actionable insights or information on trends to follow. So I know we're coming to the end of our time. So we've talked a lot about the impact and the opportunities for people in the workplace. Any additional advice beyond what we've already discussed to help leaders make sure that AI-related decisions are people-centered?
I would say think holistically about your strategy. So start with your company strategy, then layer in your AI strategy to support it. Don't think about your AI strategy in a vacuum. Oftentimes people do this. It's because it's its own entity, and so we want to put our own strategy behind it. And I think we need to think about it as an embedded function of the company. This is where a lot of enterprises messed up years and years ago. They made it its own function and they did not embed it as a part of their operational structure, which is a problem because the more removed the innovation around AI as a technology is from the actual usage of it, the worse it gets. So we need to keep these things close. So I would say keep it close to the users, keep it close to where it's being used. Have an empathetic approach to this. People are worried about their jobs, they are worried about their future. And we want to be able to reinforce the fact that they can participate in this process with us. So have a plan for that. Sometimes that's a communications plan. I mentioned it can be an educational plan, but work with your teams to figure out what that looks like. Could be a video, could be a bunch of meetings, there's a lot of ways you could do it. So I would highly suggest that. And then finally, really involve all of the different stakeholders at your company. Involve your security team, involve your existing data scientists, involve your legal and risk and compliance teams. Get them started in the conversations early so you don't run into issues that were unforeseen and didn't spend a bunch of money where you didn't need to. And involve your PMO, right? Like involve HR and L&D. They all have resources that can support this initiative, and I think it's needed. This is probably one of the most significant business transformations that will happen, in my opinion. Like we did this whole cloud transformation over the last, 8 years. And that was a pretty significant transformation of just getting off of hardware and servers that companies owned into the cloud. It enabled them to do a lot of things. But this is literally augmenting intelligence inside of a company. And so it's going to be highly transformational. It's going to touch every part of the company. So just think about it that way.
Absolutely. It's interesting because cloud is so process oriented, but this is very strategic. And I think the advice that you shared is, said like a true strategist and a leader thinking about both the business case and the human case for implementation. So I love that. I feel like that's a really great place to kind of conclude the conversation. But we have a couple of questions that we ask toward the end of our episodes. And I want to give you the choice of which one to respond to. So, one would be what excites you most about AI right now? And one would be what is your biggest AI related concern?
Great. Yeah. I think I'll talk about what excites me most about AI. And we're just starting to see some of these initial capabilities around what I mentioned earlier is called multimodal capabilities for AI, which is essentially the ability to interpret text and video and images kind of in one centralized place. So ChatGPT released its ability to interpret images. And I actually, on my Instagram, just posted an example of taking a screenshot of a website and asking ChatGPT to give you the HTML code for it, which is just really cool. It's very practical. It's combining text with images. We'll eventually get really good at doing video. And I think the more we can combine these different capabilities together, the more we'll see some of these generalized tasks actually become more cohesive. So for a long time, AI has been hyper focused on a task. Like AI under Hulu or Netflix is hyper focused on recommending a next movie or show you should watch. That is a very specific task, right? And now we can think about these more holistically and generally. And I think that's what's exciting to me the most.
Oh, that's awesome. Opportunities really are endless, and it's exciting to hear some of the use cases that you're working on and some of the things that you're experimenting with yourself. So this has been a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate your perspective. I think for me personally, as somebody who's not a technical expert but is interested, I've read a lot, but you've really helped me connect the dots, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to bring that to our listeners as well. Any last minute plugs, upcoming events, or anything that you want to share?
Yeah, I thankfully am done traveling for a little bit over the next, couple of months. So no events coming up. We did just launch our waitlist for our product on our website, which is getalignai.com. So if you're an enterprise out there thinking about what sorts of best practices to adopt and how to operationalize those best practices across your company, check out our platform. Super excited about that. And for the listeners out there, this is obviously going to be an excellent show. So make sure you subscribe because Emily's awesome. And yeah, check out AI or Die if you're interested in learning more about AI.
AI or Die has been a fantastic resource for me as well. So really appreciate the plug, Rehgan. We'll make sure to link to all the resources that you mentioned, including the thought leaders and, of course, to you and AlignAI in the show notes. But really grateful for your time today. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Workmorphous Wired. If you enjoyed the conversation, please let us know by leaving a rating and review. To make sure you don't miss any future episodes, be sure to subscribe. Finally, if you found value in today's discussion, we hope you'll pass the podcast along to a friend or colleague. As always, thanks for tuning out the noise and tuning in to Workmorphous Wired.